A very good question was asked of me by an audience member, and really it's a question that I've addressed before, but in the opposite way. The idea behind this discussion was to look up reasons why you should own and enjoy no-date watches. It's a simple enough point. I think we can all come up with our own conclusions about the subject, but I've come up with 5 reasons that I think are relatively important in the scheme of things. This all coming from someone who has quite an affinity for no-date watches, so we can also talk about design, details, the stylistic choices, and just why I believe that everyone should have at least one watch in their collection that doesn't have a date complication, or any complication for that matter. The simpler the better. The first reason, it's a call back to history. Simple. The first watches, pocket watches, wall clocks, they didn't have date complications. They simply told us the time. The obsession with hours and minutes, that's it. So when we think back to that past, that time when watchmaking was this traditional art form, like it is today, but even more so, when people would slave for hours over movements and the sheer simplicity of trying to make it work as easily as possible. When you're wearing a watch without a date, in the back of your mind there's something that tells you that you're wearing something of the past, and there is some form of tie between you, it, and what has come before it. The second reason, and this one can be discussed in both ways, allows for more style over function. What I mean by saying that is, when you're dealing with a watch that has a date complication, all of a sudden you're dealing with something that is even more functional. Now there's no denying that that is a great thing. Looking at it from both sides, you have something that tells you the time, that also keeps you up to date, quite literally. But then I believe it moves into a different category. It is more of a utility. It's more complex, visually and physically. And without a date complication, moving to reason number 3, you're given a cleaner aesthetic. Now this is really when the design starts talking. When we're looking at a watch that has a very plain looking face, where we find perfect symmetry shared between batons, between numerals, we get a much better understanding of the dial architecture and just how everything in a perfect world would be placed. And it really is celebrating that art of perfection that I think no-date watches manage to achieve. Because once they have complications, those forms of details, in the back of my mind at least, it starts drawing you away from that. It's almost as if the watch really did hit perfection, but then needed an addition. In the case of many watches, we see that date complications were added later, not sooner. And sometimes their original aesthetics have been interfered with. Moving to reason number 4, I think this is important. Simpler time telling. Adding to the whole idea of cleaner aesthetic, with a dial being less obstructive, you can tell the time much easier at a glance, because that is simply all it does. So you're not hung up with a contrast, or something that looks slightly out of proportion, that makes you focus in on it a bit further. You don't necessarily have to study the dial to know the time. And surprisingly, it's not something that is spoken about often. We would imagine that one of the best things a watch could be is something that tells us the time relatively easily, without us needing to do extra work. And it seems like the higher you go in the echelon of buying watches, the more complicated they become, the harder they are to read and tell the time. It's quite ironic, actually. But simpler time telling. Something you can do on the fly, with no obstructions, no excess, no baggage, just hours and minutes. But the most important reason, I actually based an entire video on this reason alone a couple of months back, and this is when it gets quite philosophical, but a no-date watch keeps you in the moment, and you're not obsessed about the future. So let me unpack this a bit more. I can only speak from personal experience, but whenever I see a date complication on a watch, I think about the day a lot more. I think about things like deadlines. I think possibly 3 days ahead when I know something is due. And it's that whole impression that it gives you. In a way, this does link up to reason 2, the style over function debate, where with a complication, the piece becomes a lot more functional. But then again, as a utility, it gets a bit complex. And really where the true appreciation lies, I believe, is when you can just sit back, look at the time, know what you're looking at, without any excess, without anything that gets in your way. The real beauty behind watches without complications whatsoever. The elements that the creators wanted us to see without the excess being added. And in the end, appreciating it for just being a watch. No function, apart from just telling us the time. So really, when we're closing this up and bringing the argument back together, a simple watch without a date, without any form of complication, does a lot of things. It may be the most basic looking object that you possibly own, but that is the beauty of it. We all get to sit back and enjoy the perfection, the cleanliness, simplicity, symmetry that the creators wanted us all to see before excess details were added. We get to look at a piece and enjoy something from the past, not necessarily thinking about the future. Something that is very understated as well. Something that doesn't necessarily mar your vision or divide up your attention between elements. Something that's legible, easy to read at a glance without much thought. All of these factors, I think, play into the part. Some might say it's boring, but in the end, many would ultimately return back to watches without a date, just because they are the least polarizing, the least demanding, the simplest to understand, survive eternity, and the ones that just let you enjoy the moment.